Welcome to Chapter 12. In this chapter, we're going to start our discussion about the last P of the 4 Ps of marketing, promotion. This particular P is going to take us a couple of weeks to get through, but we're certainly going to give it a good start today. I suspect many of you are familiar with Snickers' "You're Not You When You're Hungry" campaign. This is an advertising promotional campaign developed by Snickers that includes everything from taglines to innovative, catchy packaging to interesting commercials that captured people's attention. Snickers used this as a full-fledged campaign. It wasn't just a slogan, but they built their entire promotional strategy around this concept that you're not you when you're hungry. And many other companies do similar things. They develop a theme for their promotional content or promotional strategy, and they embed that theme into all of their promotional activities. And that's really what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. The last P of the 4 Ps of marketing is promotion. The promotional mix is not the same thing as the marketing mix. The marketing mix is the 4 Ps of marketing. The promotional mix are those marketing communication strategies that focus on the promotional aspect of marketing. It's a communication strategy. So please, 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 especially for the final exam, do not get promotional mix and marketing mix confused. The promotional mix consists of 5 different types of marketing communications. And really, this chapter, along with the chapters for the next 2 weeks, are really all about understanding the various parts of the promotion mix. They include advertising, which many students think is the same thing as marketing, but hopefully by now you've realized they're not exactly the same thing. Advertising is just a small part of marketing. Sales promotion, we'll talk to you more about what sales promotions are next week. Personal selling, public relations, and direct or digital marketing. Those are the 5 components of the promotional mix. Just like the other 4 Ps, or the other 3 Ps, in the marketing mix, promotion is undergoing a lot of change recently. Things that are causing the change in today's marketing communications or today's marketing promotional activities include changing customers. The way who companies are targeting is changing dramatically in terms of their overall consumer profile and in terms of their overall marketing or consumer behavior. There's dramatic changes in marketing strategies, shifting away from some of the more traditional marketing activities that may have been a primary strategy a decade or 2 ago, and those are changing quite dramatically. And of course, technology and the advancement of digital technology and what it has enabled marketers to do with respect to communications has really driven a lot of the change around marketing communications in the past decade or so. Today, marketers are able to reach smaller customer segments in innovative, interactive, and engaging ways. The technology and the resources are now in place that enable marketing communications to be much more targeted. You can provide very specific and tailored messages for individualized consumers. And I'll give you an example. If you go on to Indigo, the bookstore, if you go onto their website to do some e-shopping on their website, if you do a couple of searches for various books, you will notice very quickly on either the right-hand side of the screen, the left-hand side of the screen, or at the bottom, you will start to notice that Indigo starts to make recommendations for you. That is a form of marketing communication that is tailored for me based on my online activity in relation to the website and what I search for. What the recommendations that I would get from Indigo's website would actually be very different than the recommendations that you might get if you went on the website. Another example of sort of tailoring your marketing communications to smaller consumer segments. If you are a member of Superstore's PC Plus program, so if you swipe your card every time you do your groceries at the Superstore or any of the affiliated stores, what happens is you are providing the store with information, and I get emails about once a week from the Superstore that tells me about products that are on sale this week that I would typically might be interested in based on my previous buying behavior. So marketing communications now can be tailored specifically to me and is a much more effective communication strategy. We're also seeing a changing shift in how marketing promotional dollars are being spent. Historically, certainly 25, 30 years ago, much more of a company's marketing budget, or a higher percentage of their marketing budget, would have been spent on what we'll call traditional promotional activities, traditional advertising, traditional sales promotion, traditional behavior. But what we're seeing, and it happens every year, year over year, it increases, more and more, or a greater portion of marketing dollars or promotional dollars that companies spend are being redirected away from those traditional types of mass media marketing or promotions to more targeted and online and digital marketing activities. That doesn't mean companies aren't spending money any longer on traditional advertising. They are. It's just that as a percentage of the overall promotional budget, traditional types of marketing promotions tend to be declining, while more innovative and technology-based marketing promotions seem to be increasing in terms of the overall proportion of the promotional budget. We're also seeing this rise of what's called content marketing managers. It's no longer just the responsibility of marketers to come up with innovative marketing strategies or promotional campaigns. They're increasingly turning to what's called content developers, because good marketing communications in this day and age require really well-developed content. Visual images, video, copyrighted content that requires a really high level of skill to get it done really, really well. And we're going to talk more about that over the next few weeks. This is just a visual that shows you the 5 different components of the promotional mix, But I want to point out something that I think a lot of students get confused about. When you see marketing communications or marketing promotions from a company or a brand that you're familiar with, we have a tendency to think it has to fit in one and only one of these particular categories, when in fact a lot of marketing communications, a single act of communicating, can actually fit into more than one of these 5 boxes. You can receive a flyer in the mail that is at the exact same time an advertisement but also a sales promotion. So these aren't mutually exclusive types of communications. In fact, really good integrated marketing communications blends these things seamlessly so that you get advertising, sales promotion, and personal selling, for example, all in one act of communication. So please, when you look at the different marketing communication activities, please don't think that you have to fit them into only one of the boxes. Really good marketing communications is in fact integrated and very often will fit into more than one of these boxes at a given time. These next 2 slides provide you a very quick overview of the differences between the different promotional tools. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over these because we're going to spend a lot more time over the rest of this lecture and also the lectures for the next few weeks going into these in much, much more detail. But very quickly, advertisements or advertising is all about reaching large masses of buyers at a relatively low cost per exposure, meaning it costs very little for every person you're able to reach in advertising. It helps build a long-term image for a product. So it's vital in terms of developing that overall brand image and identity for a product. It can trigger quick sales. It helps make the product more sort of in people's minds and can really help increase your sales relatively quickly. It has a very public nature and is viewed as legitimate. When people see products or services or brands through advertising, it lends an air of legitimacy to the company, the brand, and the product. It seems like, well, if they're able to invest in advertising, this thing must be real. It can be very expressive. It's a way to add personality to some brands and some identity. But it is impersonal, meaning you can't target your advertising messages to the unique needs of each individual. So it's impersonal and lacks the direct persuasiveness of salespeople because it's relatively easy to ignore. In fact, your generation, younger people, have become incredibly good at ignoring or finding ways to avoid being exposed to advertising messages. How many of you stream entertainment content rather than watch traditional TV, for example? One of the reasons you do that is so that you don't have to see the advertisements. And so marketers are having to become even more creative when coming up with their advertising strategy to reach really important consumer markets. Personal selling is another of the promotional tools. Personal selling involves an interaction between two or more people. That interaction can be in person, it can be over the telephone, or it can be digital. For example, email or chat rooms or that sort of thing. It allows for all kinds of customer relationships to spring up. And as we've talked about a number of times in this course, relationships are really, really important in marketing. Buyers tend to feel like they're being listened to and that their specific needs are being responded to. It's also, however, by far the most expensive type of promotional strategy that you can use. Personal selling costs the most by a mile. However, it's also the most effective. It works really, really well, especially for certain kinds of products over others, where people maybe need a little bit of assistance in working their way through the 5 steps of the buying process. Personal selling is very, very effective, but it is also very expensive, and we'll talk more about that next week. Continuing on, sales promotions. Please make sure you understand the difference between the general promotional tools and the specific tool that's called sales promotion. They are not the same thing, and a lot of students get those things confused on the exam, for example. They don't understand the difference between the promotional mix or general promotional strategies and sales promotion, which is a very specific type of promotional activity. There's a wide array of different activities that qualify as sales promotion. Each of them have unique qualities and are helpful at achieving very specific goals. Sales promotions are used to attract customers' attention and offer them incentives to purchase products right away or in a very short period of time. So these work really, really well to get people to respond quickly, but it tends to have really short-term effects. The effects of sales promotions don't last beyond the actual time frame the sales promotion is active. Public relations is another type of promotional tool. It tends to be very readily believable to consumers. People believe the information that they're given when it's given through public relations type activities, much more so than information that is given through things like advertisements. It can really help dramatize a company or a product and again add legitimacy to companies and products. It can reach various different stakeholders who you may need to reach in your promotional activities, and it's very effective and relatively inexpensive when it's well thought out and well conducted. And again, we'll talk more about that later. And the last of the 5 different promotional strategies in the promotional mix is called direct and digital marketing. These are marketing communications that are more targeted to specific consumers and tend to be interactive. They're very immediate and they're highly personalized. And again, we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about direct and digital marketing next week. There are two different broad types of promotional strategies, push versus pull. A push strategy is when the producer targets most, not necessarily all, but most or a lot of their promotional communications to the intermediaries. And then they rely on the intermediaries to do some of the communication or promotion for the company. That the communications from retailers and wholesalers is targeted to end consumers. Right? So when you get the flyer in the mail from Sobeys and on the front page are featured Kellogg's breakfast cereals, that's a retailer, Sobeys, doing some marketing communications on behalf of the producer, Kellogg's breakfast cereals. In comparison, producers could target or direct their marketing communications to the end consumer, which is called a pull strategy. When producers target their marketing communication strategies to consumers, consumers will then go to retailers or wholesalers and demand these products that they're seeing or hearing about through their producers. And in return, those wholesalers and retailers will reach out to the producers to ensure that they're carrying the products that consumers are looking for. So it's important to understand the distinction between a push and a pull strategy when it comes to marketing promotions. It's really about who's doing the communicating and to whom. And sort of are there intermediaries in between, and how do all these various partners in the communication process fit together. So the first type of promotional activity that we're going to delve deeper into is advertising. And as I said earlier in this lecture, when I ask students in the beginning of a semester in intro marketing, what does marketing mean? I'm always surprised, I guess a little bit, but happy that students very often say marketing and advertising are the same thing. And I'm happy because that gives me an opportunity to point out that actually that's not true. It's a very, very common misconception, and I hope by this point in the semester, when you realize that we're on chapter 12 and now just starting to talk about advertising, that you quickly will realize that marketing is much bigger and much more complicated and diverse than just advertising. Having said that, advertising is a really, really important part of a promotional strategy that companies and businesses use to help them achieve their objectives. There's some major decisions that need to get made with respect to your advertising strategy. First is, what are your overall objectives for your advertising strategy? How much money are you going to spend in your advertising activities? What message do you want to deliver, and how do you want to deliver that message? And lastly, how can you go about evaluating whether or not your advertising strategies are actually working and helping you achieve the organization's objectives? So it's probably useful to start with a definition of advertising. Advertising is the use of paid, owned, earned, and shared media by the seller or a producer for the purposes of informing, persuading, and reminding customers about its products or organization. Advertising decisions, again, revolve around setting objectives, setting the budget, deciding on the message, deciding on how you're going to deliver that message, and on evaluating results. And ultimately, you want to be able to calculate, using actual numbers, the return on your advertising investment. So if you as an organization decide you're going to spend $100,000 on advertising, you want to be able to calculate what a return on that investment means for your organization. And so we don't spend any time in this class talking about or doing any of those sort of financial calculations, but just like you would in a finance or accounting class, you actually can measure the effect of many of your marketing strategies by using a return on investment type calculation. I will also point out, however, that that's not the only way to measure the success of an advertising campaign. It's not always easy to boil it down to dollars and cents, but that is certainly one way you can evaluate the effectiveness of an advertising campaign. So why do companies use advertising? What are their objectives in spending all this money on advertising? And they do spend a lot of money. The biggest advertiser in the world is actually Procter & Gamble. They are the makers of Crest and Tide laundry detergent and a whole host of other consumer-oriented products. And that company spends billions of dollars a year just on advertising, not on the other types of promotional activities, just on advertising. So there's three broad categories of objectives for advertising. The first is to be informative. If you're focusing on informative advertising, you're really focusing on communicating customer value and letting them know how your product can provide them with value. You're working on building a brand and company image in the minds of consumers. You may be telling target audiences or markets about a new product that's now in the marketplace. You may be explaining how a product actually works. You could be suggesting new uses for a product. Did you know this can also be used for whatever? You can inform the market of maybe changes in your pricing strategy. You can describe various available services and supports that go along with the product, and you can correct false impressions. So if you're looking to focus on informative advertising, that's the strategy that you would use to achieve some of those objectives. Persuasive advertising is another advertising objective. It's used to build brand preference. So informative advertising was about building brand and company image or awareness, but persuasive advertising is about building brand preference. It's not enough that people are aware of your product. You want them to prefer your product over the competitor's product. Persuasive advertising can be used to encourage people to switch brands from the competitors to your brand. It can be used to encourage changing customer perceptions of product value. If the value that you're providing to customers through your product has evolved, you can use persuasive advertising to communicate those changing natures of value. You can use persuasive advertising to persuade customers to purchase now. Don't wait till later, purchase now. You can use persuasive advertising to create customer engagement and to build brand community. The last of the possible advertising objectives is reminder advertising. Reminder advertising is used to maintain customer relationships that you've already established. Reminder advertising is targeting your existing customers, not looking for new customers, not trying to recapture customers who may have been yours but you've lost them. Reminder advertising is all about maintaining those existing customer relationships. Reminder advertisement can be used to remind customers that the product may be needed in the near future. So you want this product in top of mind for consumers so that when they are out shopping, they remember, oh, I need to pick up some more, whatever it is. You may want to remind the customers where they can buy the product. And lastly, you want to use reminder advertising to help keep the brand in a customer's minds during the off seasons. You don't want your customers to forget about you, so reminder advertising is used to keep your brand and your product in consumers' minds. One of the decisions marketers need to make is how much money are they going to spend on advertising. As we mentioned a few slides ago when we introduced the idea of advertising, we said it's actually quite expensive, but there's a relatively low cost per exposure. So yes, it costs a lot of money, but you can reach a lot of people. So the cost per exposure is relatively low. So there's four main strategies for setting your advertising budget. The first one is probably the most common by far. It's you spend whatever you can afford. So you take a look at your organization's overall financial situation and try to figure out how much can you afford to spend on advertising. It's not really a great strategy for setting a budget. Um, it doesn't take into account the realities of what you're trying to achieve and who you're trying to reach and your overall organization's objectives. But especially for small companies that don't necessarily have the resources or time to invest in a more comprehensive budgeting model, the affordable model tends to be the most common. Another fairly common method is a percentage of sales. So that typically is used at an industry level, and so for different industries, there may be sort of a general standard of how much of your revenue that comes in gets spent on advertising for that product category. And it would differ quite widely by different industry categories. The percentage of sales, for example, for soft drinks might be very different than the percentage of sales, say, for the automobile industry. But using a percentage of sales method says, well, if our sales are X amount of dollars, we're going to spend 5% of that revenue on advertising to grow sales into the future. Competitive parity method is trying to figure out what your competition is spending on advertising and spending similarly to them, or maybe spending a little bit more if you're trying to steal market share from them. So you basically take a look at what your competitors are doing and try to do something similar in terms of setting your budget and making decisions around how much money you're going to spend on advertising. And the last strategy for setting the advertising budget is called objective and task method. And it is the least common because it is probably the most complex. This requires your advertising or marketing people to have very, very clear objectives for their advertising strategy. What exactly is it that you're trying to achieve? How are you going to achieve it? And spending whatever amount of money that is to achieve the goal. And most, especially small companies, just do not have the resources to do that. Some of the larger companies, and I mean really large companies, might have the resources to figure this all out and be able to spend that kind of money. But for small companies, that's just not reasonable or practical for them. Another thing you need to decide when it comes to your advertising strategy is what your message is going to be and how you're going to deliver that message. Those are two really, really important things to consider when developing your advertising strategy. When it comes to creating good advertising messages and brand content, one of the biggest challenges today is breaking through the clutter. The average consumer is exposed to thousands of marketing messages every day. Not all of them are advertising messages, but a lot of them are. How are you going to develop an advertising message that breaks through all that clutter and captures your audience's attention? There's an increasing movement towards the merger of advertising and entertainment. What customers are saying is, if you want my attention, if you want me to listen or pay attention to your advertising messages, you better entertain me. And so there's this blurring of the lines between advertising and entertainment. Think, for example, of the Super Bowl commercials that we watch every year related to the football Super Bowl thing that happens, I guess, early in February. Those advertisements that air on TV, they're the most expensive time slot for advertisements anywhere in the world. And these advertisements are incredibly entertaining because marketers recognize that in order to capture people's attention, you have to give them really good content. And so we're seeing a blending of advertising and entertainment. There are specific message and content strategies that can be used, things like humor or music or sex appeal or testimonials or scientific evidence or demonstrations. These are all strategies that advertising can use to help get the message across. right? And you can do it through various, you can do it through spokespeople, you can do it through celebrities, you can do it through cartoon characters. There's a variety of ways you can execute that message. And then, of course, another important and growing important type of advertising message or brand content is consumer-generated content. Consumers are now putting their own marketing messages out there into the public domain, and they're having an impact on the kinds of messaging and brand content that companies are doing. Another major decision that advertisers need to make is what media are they going to use? Media are the vehicles through which advertising messages are delivered to their intended audiences. They could include things like television, radio, newspapers, magazines, billboards, etc. Some of the steps in making, or some considerations in making advertising media selections include things like, how many people am I going to reach through this particular media? How frequently can I reach them? What is the overall impact and how engaged are consumers in this particular media? You need to make some decisions about the major media types. Some are more effective than others, and it depends on not only your product, but also the messaging strategy and your target audience. Different media will work in different situations. You also want to select specific media vehicles. So, for example, major media types would include television, for example. But selecting specific media vehicles include what channels are you going to advertise on and during what time slots or television programs might you want to advertise on. So it's not just making the decision that we're going to have TV ads as part of our marketing strategy. You also need to figure out what types of channels, what television shows, what time slots do you want your advertisements to appear in. So yeah, choosing the timing, what time of day, how frequently, what time of year, all those kinds of things need to happen when you're selecting your advertising media. These next two slides just give you a little bit of an overview of some of the major media types that would be options for your advertising strategy. Of course, you've got television. So there's pretty good mass market coverage for using TV ads, relatively low cost per exposure. It's actually quite expensive, but the cost per exposure is relatively low. It can combine various sort of sensory elements like sight, sound, and motion and appeal to those senses. But it actually is quite expensive. It's a high absolute cost. There's a high level of clutter and what's called fleeting exposure. You know, most young people these days don't watch television in the traditional way. You tend to watch entertainment content by streaming it, or maybe you DVR it and you skip through the advertisements. If you are watching live television where there are commercials and you can't actively avoid them, we often use that time to go get a drink from the kitchen, make a run to the washroom, or check our phones. So people are being quite conscientiously finding ways to avoid being exposed to television advertisements. So yeah, there's some real advantages, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to capture people's attention through TV ads. You've got digital, mobile, and social media advertisements. So you can be highly selective and really targeted in your digital and mobile and social media ads. It can be relatively low cost. It can be effective immediately. You can, decide you're going to have a digital advertising campaign and deliver it almost immediately. And there are opportunities for engaging with people and having some interaction and two-way flow of communication. It can have low impact, and there's a high amount of audience control over whether or not they're exposed to your messages, and you can easily ignore them. You just simply don't click on them, and you can often ignore those kinds of messages. Newspapers offer some flexibility. It can be pretty timely and tends to be really good for local market coverage. It's broadly acceptable and it's highly believable. People have trust advertisements that they see in their local newspapers. They tend to have a short life, poor reproduction quality, meaning it's usually black and white. There's a small pass-along audience component, meaning I'm done with my newspaper, I may loan it to my neighbor, for example, or give it to somebody else. But the other challenge with newspapers is declining readership, that people are reading fewer paper-based newspapers. We are reading them online, but not necessarily physical copies of newspapers like we were maybe a generation ago. Direct mail has high audience selectivity, can be relatively flexible, and there's no competition. It can allow for personalization. So these are things you get in the mail that are aimed and targeted at you. It's relatively high cost per exposure, and there's a real risk of being perceived as junk by your target audience. Magazines can be really effective for specific demographics. If you've got a magazine that's targeted to a very specific target audience and your brand fits with that, that can be a really great opportunity. It's very credible, and there's a high level of prestige for advertising in magazines. There tends to be a relatively long life and good pass-along readership, meaning that magazines tend to stick around longer and get passed around between people, so there's more exposure. The challenges with magazines is there's a long lead time for purchasing. So, for example, if you wanted to appear in a magazine in the November or December issue of that magazine, you would often have to make your advertising commitment early in the summer. And so that can be really problematic, and it tends to be relatively high cost. So again, can be really useful and effective if you have a very specific target audience and a magazine where those target audiences overlap quite high. That can be really effective, but sort of for general marketing, maybe not as effective. Radio has really good local acceptance. A couple of years ago, I was teaching an MBA class, and we had Jennifer Evans from the local radio station come in and talk to my class. And she was talking about the relative impact of radio advertising, and I was shocked by some of the statistics about how effective it actually can be, particularly in a local market. So good local acceptance, can be very highly geographic and demographically selective, and relatively low cost compared to other types of media. It's audio only, so you obviously don't benefit from visual stimulation, and there can be fleeting exposure, meaning people may or may not be, the radio may be on in the background, but they may not be really paying attention. So yeah, there can be some challenges around that. And lastly is outdoor advertising, which would be things like billboards or signage. It can be relatively flexible, high repeat exposure and low cost. And if you get a really good location, can be actually quite effective. But you don't have a lot of control over who sees your message. And there's obviously some creativity limitations to what you can do with outdoor signage. Although with technology, people are getting more and more creative with that particular media. So lastly, it's important to understand how to evaluate your advertising effectiveness and calculate that return on investment. The formula for return on advertising investment is net return on advertising divided by the cost of the advertising investment. So how much money did you earn as an organization because of these advertising activities divided by the cost of the advertising? That sounds easy, but it can often be very difficult to know how much of your revenue can be specifically tied to a specific advertising investment. So if somebody buys your product, how do you know for certain that it's because of your advertising campaign? Maybe it was because of something else. So the formula is relatively easy, but it's not necessarily always easy to tabulate or to calculate. So advertisers should be regularly evaluating not only how much money they're making from their advertising activities, but also some other effects, things like communications. So how is your advertising being perceived by customers? Is it changing in a positive way consumers' view of your product or brand? So not all advertising objectives have to be about increasing the bottom line of the organization. There's no question that's important. Sales and profitability are incredibly important for every business. But advertising has objectives beyond just the monetary objectives as well. And so it's important to figure out ways to measure the effectiveness of your advertising in terms of those objectives, as well as the monetary objectives. So who does advertising in an organization? Well, if you're a small company, it could be the owner of the company or a very small sales department that is responsible for developing advertising strategies. Small firms often do things in-house because they don't have the resources to pay for external expertise. And so it really could be any number of people in the organization who take on that responsibility. Larger organizations may actually have their own advertising or marketing departments. They could have a marketing department, or even more specifically, they could have an advertising department. And they would be staffed with people who are skilled in the development and creation and execution of advertising strategies. And for other companies, they go outside of the organization and look for consultancy groups that will help them in planning, preparing, creating, implementing, and evaluating their advertising program. And there are companies, even here in Charlottetown, that is their primary business activity. They provide advertising expertise for other local businesses. And so you could go to an outside agency to get this work done as well. When your advertising activities extend beyond the border, so international advertising, there are a few things that you want to consider. How much of your advertising strategy do you need to change or adapt to different geographic locations around the world? There's a real benefit to having a generally standardized advertising approach. It costs less because you garner some economies of scale. It allows for greater coordination around the globe, and it helps create a more consistent worldwide image. So there are some arguments for having a relatively standardized advertising strategy for all your markets around the world. However, standardization does have some drawbacks. It can ignore the fact that different countries or different markets can differ significantly in their culture, their demographics, and their economic conditions, which all may have an impact on the effectiveness of your advertising campaign. So there isn't a right answer or a wrong answer here. The answer tends to be it depends on the circumstance. There's some real advantages to having a fairly standardized advertising strategy across geographic locations, but there's also some real drawbacks to doing that as well. We're going to move on now away from advertising and now talk about another aspect of the promotional mix, public relations or PR. So you often hear people talk about their PR person or their PR rep. PR stands for public relations. Public relations activities include things like press relations or working with the media. It includes publicity. It includes public affairs. It includes lobbying. So if you're a lobbyist for an industry, for example, and you lobby various levels of government, you're part of a PR department. Investor relations. So if you are a publicly owned company, part of your responsibilities, if you are the PR person for the organization or in the PR department, is to communicate with not just consumers, but with your investors to make sure that they have all the information that they need to make good decisions. And of course, for the development and growth of the company as well. So in PR, some of the public relations functions include working with the press, product publicity, public affairs. We just talked about these, lobbying, investor relations, and development. Some of the tools that you use are news releases or press releases, special events, things like grand openings or anniversary events, or other kinds of special events that you use to get your message out there. It can be various written materials like pamphlets or brochures or catalogs, or it could be manuals, etc., that are used and shared with various audiences. It could be audio-visual material. It could be corporate identity material. So, it could be putting the corporate or company logo onto golf shirts or pens or umbrellas or mouse pads or any of those kinds of things. Those are PR activities. Or public service activities, so getting involved in sort of community-oriented events and using those as tools for communication. A company's website and their online social media can also be forms of public relations vehicles. This is an example, again, where PR and direct or digital marketing can actually sort of be embedded in one singular communication activity. So is a company's website a PR tool, or is it a digital marketing tool? And the answer is it's both. Public relations can be used to promote products, people. That's very common. If you listen to celebrities talk, sometimes they'll talk about their publicist or their PR person. Well, this is what they're talking about. So you can promote or you can use public relations for people, for ideas, for organizations, and for nations or geographic regions. It's really good at developing important relationships, not only with customers, but other stakeholders as well, including investors, the media, and other communities. So this is one of the things that makes public relations really different. Most other promotional activities are targeted at consumers. Public relations can be targeted at consumers, but it can be also targeting investors, the media, and other important communities or members of the public. Public relations can rebuild interest in commodities for trade associations. There's a whole bunch of functionalities for public relations that we don't typically see in mainstream marketing communications. What are the impacts of public relations? Well, there's a strong impact on public awareness at a relatively lower cost than advertising. It can be actually quite impactful. It's also very, very believable. As I mentioned to you earlier, consumers believe the information that they receive through public relations type activities more so than they do through advertising type activities. There's a power to engage customers and make them part of the brand story by injecting them into daily conversation. So PR can be very effective in that way. It has typically limited or scattered use. It doesn't tend to be a cornerstone of marketing communications for a lot of companies. There could be various reasons for that. In some cases, very good reasons, but there's probably some opportunity to use public relations more than most companies are using them. And it can be a really powerful brand building tool for companies if they use it right. So we talked about the major public relations tools a little bit already, but I'm going to give you some examples. So let's say you're a company like Apple and you've got a new product that's entering the marketplace. You may issue a news release or a press release or have a press conference. That would be considered public relations. And one of the reasons why it's so inexpensive is because it doesn't cost a whole lot to get that information out to major news outlets. The problem, of course, is that you can't control whether or not the news outlets actually pick up your story and share it. Now, if you're a company like Apple, I guarantee you news outlets are going to cover that story. But if you're just a small, locally owned company, there's no guarantee that the news media is going to pick up an announcement that you release through a press release about a new product that you've developed. You can hold special events, like I said, grand openings or expansions, or maybe you totally remodeled the inside of your store, or any reason or excuse you have to do something special that's going to bring people in can be a public relations tool. Again, written materials, that could include brochures, it could include manuals, it could include booklets, it could include information. So for example, when you buy something that requires some assembly, the information, the written material that comes with the product that tells you how to put the product together, that's an example of public relations. Anything that's prepared, all the documents that are prepared for investors, for example, prior to shareholders' meetings, those are considered public relations tools. The public finances of publicly traded companies, those are considered public relations tools as well. You could have some audio visual materials. So for example, if you're the CEO of Starbucks, maybe once a year you create an audio visual message to all of your employees, and you send it out through a secure channel to your employees. So that would be an example of an audio visual material that would be public relations. The audience in this case isn't your end consumers, it's actually your internal audiences, which are your employees. So again, public relations isn't always targeting consumers. There are other important groups that promotional or public relations tools might target, and employees certainly can be one of those. Lots of companies develop what's called corporate identity materials. It's often called swag. So if lots of companies have their own, golf shirts or hats or lanyards or golf balls or those sorts of things that they either give to their employees to use or give out to their customers. One of the things that's common coming up sort of as the end of the 2020 approaches, a lot of companies develop calendars that are sponsored by the company and have corporate material in the calendars, and that's an example of corporate identity materials. And other types of public service activities. So it could be, you encourage your employees to go and, volunteer at a particular organization to do some community good. So for example, Canadian Tire here in Charlottetown, they sponsored a new accessibility playground down in Victoria Park. That's an example of a public service activity. Employees of Canadian Tire were involved in setting up the playground, and so that's an example of public service activities.